Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Hello, we're recording at the end of 2025 and we're going to look back over developments this year and stare into our crystal ball about 2026. And it's just Rob and I. It's been a significant year with two major reviews on sentencing and court reform and concerns about delays in the system and the number of defendants in prison awaiting trial. Rob, prisons and their capacity continue to be a headache for the government. Can you talk a bit about the prisons and the numbers in them?
Well, every year the government produce projections about the numbers they expect to be remanded and sentenced to prison. Those projections have been going up steadily and sharply. The latest ones suggest if nothing were done, we've got about 87,000 people in prison now. It could reach 100,000 by the end of the decade in 2030.
It's never been that high, has it?
Never. I mean, when I first started working in the early 1990s, I worked in the Home Office. What was the prison population? 40-odd thousand. And I think it's in part because there have been in the last few years more and more people coming into the system. The percentage of people who end up getting a custodial sentence has been going up. The numbers held in prison waiting to go to court has gone up. And because the sentence lengths have risen so much, there's quite a long tail to that. What do I mean? People who were sentenced 10 years ago who got long sentences, they're still there, of course.
And in terms of the capacity issues, this government came in and brought in measures to release people early because there was so few places in prison. And they literally were worried that people would be sentenced and there wouldn't be a place for them. Has that situation vastly improved?
Still very tight. I mean, when Labour came in last year, they were facing a really, really serious crisis. That's been stabilised up to a point through these early release measures, through measures to get some foreign prisoners deported earlier in their sentence, measures to reduce the periods that people are recalled to prison if they mess up when they're supervised after having been released from prison. They don't come back to prison for so long. But the big hope, and it obviously came out this year, was this sentencing review. So David Gauke, who had formerly been a Conservative Justice Secretary, and a panel of experts produced two reports, actually. One analysing why has the prison population gone up so rapidly. Very good analysis and diagnosis. And then in May, I think this year, produced his final report, what to do about it. That slightly disappointing in some respects.
In what way? Because interestingly, our present prisons minister, Lord Timpson, before he became a minister, said publicly that he thought 2/3 of those in prison didn't need to be there. Was that kind of thought translated through into what David Gauke said?
Nothing quite on that scale, no. And I think the big problem for me was, although this was supposedly a sentencing review, and you would expect that to look at what are the lengths of sentences that people get for particular offences.
And all sentences and sentence inflation and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but it didn't really look at that. It looked at how sentences are implemented. And he was obviously told by ministers, look, we need to reduce the numbers of people going to prison and how long they spend in prison. But rather than say, well, let's have shorter sentences, he said, well, yes, short sentences will suspend many of those. So if you get a sentence of up to a year, rather than serve it in prison, it will be suspended. You will not go to prison. You will be under supervision by the probation service. You may have some conditions attached to that. And if you mess up on that, you can go to prison. But basically, keep your nose clean, you'll stay out of prison.
I mean, you can already use suspended sentences now.
Absolutely.
So this is kind of saying never use a prison sentence under a year where the person would serve the time in a prison, suspend them all, as opposed to now when some are suspended and some aren't.
Not quite never. So
Right.
the phrase is a presumption. So when courts are considering these kinds of cases, there must be a starting point that the sentence will be suspended. Now, there are some exceptions in terms of the types of offences, the previous records, previous compliance. And one of the key issues looking forward, assuming this becomes law and is implemented next year, is how those exceptions will play out, how many cases will continue to get short sentences. I mean, they've had a presumption against short sentences in Scotland for several years now, and that hasn't eradicated short prison sentences. Courts can find exceptions sometimes in order to impose a sentence, or they could impose a sentence which is slightly above 12 months, so this presumption doesn't apply. And that's one of the uncertainties about this. I mean, the legislation was introduced in September, I think. It's gone through its House of Commons stages. As things stand, it's got a little bit to go in the House of Lords, but could easily become law in January 2026. Then there is a question of when it will come into force, but because of this still precarious state of the prison population, I imagine they will want to move towards implementation pretty quickly.
Yeah. So going back to this situation with prison numbers, whereby they're predicted to go up to 100,000, did David Gauke address that and say this is a bad idea for our prison numbers to go up and up? They've already doubled in the last 20 years. Is it a good idea for them to go to 100,000? Did he produce ideas which would stop more prisons having to be built?
Yes and no. Mainly no. It was a kind of given that there was going to be this big increase in prison numbers. The main problem with the Gauke review was it was not radical enough. He didn't sit back and say, actually, do we want to have all these additional prison places? Is that contributing to a reduction in crime, a safer society, or are there other ways we could use all of that money on these new prison places? He suggested there should be a kind of independent body from government that might look at those kinds of questions and look in the long term about the role of imprisonment alongside the role of all sorts of other things: healthcare, poverty reduction, education, social services, the kinds of things that can address the problems that many of those in prison have in spades. But he himself didn't look at that really. He looked at how to make the sums add up.
To stop the prisons literally bursting and there not being enough places. So basically what's been accepted amongst mainstream politicians is that our prison numbers will go up, and it's just a question of how to accommodate those numbers as the numbers go up.
Basically, it's managing the system. It's not questioning whether this is the right approach, what prisons should be for, whether there are better ways of dealing with many of those who go into prisons. At the end of the day, I think the idea was to come up with some ideas that would actually stop the thing falling over. We mentioned the suspended sentence. His other big idea was what he called earned early release. He visited Texas, where they have a system where apparently if you behave well, attend treatment programs.
In prison,
throw yourself into rehabilitation, you can earn an earlier release point. And he said, yep, that's the way to go. And that is how the early release scheme that he proposed and the government are legislating for is being sold. But I have to say, there's not a lot of earning in it. Currently, for most sentences, you get out after serving 40%. Under the Gauke sentencing bill proposals, you'll get out after serving 33%. You won't have to do anything positive to earn that release point. You will have to stay out of trouble in the sense that if you refuse to obey orders, cause damage to your cell.
You won't get this early release, but if you just in the main are okay in prison, you will get out after a third of the sentence given to you by the court.
Yeah.
Yeah. So an idea which was framed as you will get a reward for doing rehabilitative activities in prison has turned round to automatic early release because it's what they need to make the numbers add up.
Exactly that. And it's possible that in due course there may be an opportunity to revisit the idea once prisons are able to offer rehabilitative programs on the scale required to prisoners, to be able to look at that again and say, actually, perhaps prisoners need to work a little bit harder to get this early release than they are. But certainly for the moment, as a Ministry of Justice official told me, it's really smoke and mirrors.
Stepping back a bit then, we've basically got some tinkering with the system, but the radical thing, which is that so many more people are going to go to prison, there seems no political, public or activist protest out there.
Very little. And I was shocked, and I know you were. Last week, the government produced a press release boasting that their prison building boom would make streets safer. And they announced the latest wave of new prisons, of new prison places in existing prisons, in a kind of completely unquestioning way. They weren't looking at all at the deeper questions of, is this actually
going to make streets safer?
Yeah.
And and the evidence kind of says it isn't going to make streets safer.
No. I mean, there are plenty of things you could do to make streets safer. So many people we've heard about in our podcasts in prisons have got mental health problems of one sort or another. Has the NHS got the capacity to deal with those people and their difficulties outside prison? Increasingly not. So couldn't some of the funding that's going into prison cells be used for those sorts of alternative approaches? It's not saying don't do anything with people who cause harm and cause problems. It's just prison seems to be the only show in town.
Whereas we are now kind of international outliers, at least in the sort of Western democracies, aren't we? Because even in the USA, the prison numbers are going down and arguments are being made about whether prison works or not.
Yeah, we are. I was looking at the data. So the way you compare is to look at the number of prisoners per 100,000 in the general population. So we've got about 140 prisoners for every 100,000. The Netherlands, it's half that. Germany, it's half that, 70 odd per 100,000. Why is that? Are we looking carefully at the kinds of approaches that they've got in these countries, which means that prison is reserved as a kind of last resort? I mean, the only thing I would say is that it might seem to some that I'm carping overly about this, because there is an attempt to control an otherwise uncontrollable prison population, and more people who break the law seriously will be supervised in the community by the probation service rather than put in prison. For me and for many, that's a good thing. There is, of course, a big issue that next year we'll be able to judge. Is the probation service equipped, staffed, resourced to be able to deal with those additional challenges that they'll face as a result of all of these changes?
By the way, the evidence is that crime is actually, it went down for a very long time and it's stabilised recently. So these extra prison numbers or extra probation numbers are not a reflection of an increase in crime overall. They are a decision by government to punish in a different way. And I think what's interesting is they could take all the sentencing down, as it were. So even reduce the number on probation through taking sentences down from a community order, etc. And they've just pushed everything up.
Yeah, that's true. It's a decision about, wanting to deliver more punishment. And for certain kinds of offences, the government have got clear targets to actually increase the numbers of people coming into the system, particularly in relation to violence against women and girls, for instance. So in a way, the criminal justice system will be fed with more and more people.
Despite the fact that crime isn't actually increasing itself.
It's not, but there's still enough of it out there to mean that the system will struggle to deal with it. So I don't think the government's hope that there will be a sort of sustainable future, the immediate crisis in prisons and criminal justice will be resolved. I think, well, to coin a phrase, the jury's out. And perhaps that's a note on which to turn to some issues about the courts that you've been...
Which are related, aren't they?
They are. It's all related.
I mean, the reason court reform is on the agenda at all is because, again, they have a bit of a crisis there, a backlog of cases, such that a case which is going to trial in the Crown Court, the actual trial will be 3 or 4 years away from now. And that is causing a problem on prison numbers because it means that a lot of people are waiting for their trials in prison on remand, but also it's a crisis in itself because victims and people accused of crime are waiting this inordinate time for their cases to be resolved.
So there's this crisis of ridiculously long delays in the system. What did the government seek to do about that?
This backlog is kind of been building and building for years, and the Labour Party came in without, it appears, a strategy as to how to deal with it. You know, they got David Gauke to do the sentencing review, and then they got Sir Brian Leveson, who's an very senior judge, to have a look at the whole system, particularly the efficiency of the system and how, as it were, to address the backlog. And Sir Brian has some very particular ideas which he came up with.
What are they in a nutshell?
Well, the big idea, which has been floating around amongst some of the judiciary for a very, very long time, is to restrict the kind of cases that juries deal with. So obviously everybody thinks our justice system is based on a judge and jury, 12 good men and true, looking at cases, deciding what happens. In reality, it's the minority of cases where it's a jury who decides whether somebody's guilty or not, and for the most serious crimes. But even so, there are some crimes which judge and juries deal with, which I think people like Sir Brian just thinks this is disproportionate. So what you get is high-level criminal damage cases, drugs cases, and perhaps the one where the judges have been most unhappy, which is something called assault emergency worker. And that's a crime which is about a member of the public assaulting a police officer, a firefighter, a nurse, or whatever. Now, if you say the word assault, you think they've done an injury, but actually this level of assault has no lasting physical injury. It is shouting at somebody, shoving them, whatever. So they're dealing with these cases of one person shouting at another with themselves, a Crown Court judge and a jury. And it's expensive and it takes a long time. And they think this is absurd.
And these are cases where the defendant currently can elect to go down that route.
Yes. And what Leveson has said is, A, defendants shouldn't be able to choose. B, he's saying it's absurd that this kind of case should be dealt with in front of a jury. So he proposed a new kind of court in between the judge and jury court and the magistrates court, which is where most cases are heard at the moment.
Sounds quite sensible to me. How's it gone down?
Well, when Sir Brian Leveson brought his review out in July, to be honest, there wasn't a lot of hoo-ha about it. I mean, there was a bit of unhappiness amongst lawyers expressed. I mean, partly I think it's because it came out in July and also because it wasn't government policy. And then we waited for what the government thought about Sir Brian's proposals. And then a couple of weeks ago, there was a major leak of government thinking about this, followed by a government announcement that they did want to do this new court. They did want to restrict jury trials. and that any case which would have a sentence likely to be no more than 3 years long would be dealt with by this intermediate court. I mean, this is keeping magistrates' courts for the lower level offences, but that there would be these medium level offences which would be dealt with. And this is a critical difference from what Sir Brian said. So Sir Brian said, let's have this intermediate court, not have a judge and jury, but have a judge, probably a Crown Court judge, with 2 magistrates. So a panel of 3, like you have in the magistrates' courts, to judge these cases like assault emergency worker. But the government just came out suddenly and said yes to intermediate court, which was already controversial, and actually it's going to be 1 judge.
So no magistrates alongside them?
No, just 1 judge. And that is really quite a departure from what Sir Brian said. And also it has caught fire in terms of protest and opposition to the proposals. And interestingly, compared to, say, the sentencing bill, if they legislate on this, I think there really might be some trouble, because some Labour backbenchers, and not just the most left wing of the Labour Party, have expressed quite a lot of disquiet about it. And it's partly the idea of restricting jury trials per se, but partly the fact, I think, that it's a single judge.
More likely to have some trouble in the House of Lords as well, do you think? Because there's a lot of lawyers in the Lords who might not like it.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is this government has a massive majority, and nothing on criminal justice and policing so far has got anywhere near losing them a vote. So the real question is this it? I mean, the answer is I don't know. And to be honest, we also don't have any detail of what the government is proposing, because we had a kind of press release and quite a short statement in Parliament, and that's it.
So Leveson produced several 100-page report, and there hasn't been a detailed response from the government about exactly how they intend to legislate in response to it yet.
No, they say they will. And they made this statement which caused all the ructions. And so who knows, they might retreat in face of all this opposition, because what the lawyers are really unhappy about is the idea that you would have fewer jury trials. They are passionate that jury trials are the epitome of just process. I mean, I'm worried about the impact in terms of sentencing, partly because we actually just don't have very good data. People always talk about magistrates' courts being more punitive than Crown courts. They also talk about juries being more likely to acquit than judges sitting on their own. And if that was the case, it would be worrying. Unfortunately, we simply don't have the data. And another announcement that the government has made is actually to give magistrates and district judges greater powers to sentence to prison than they have at the moment. At the moment, they can sentence somebody to 1 year for a single offence. So if there's more than one offence, that sentence might go up. And Leveson said that was the right level. The government are saying magistrates' powers should be increased to 18 months and maybe to 2 years. Now, that's a massive increase. And again, we simply don't know what their record is on sentencing for a similar offence to what the Crown Court would do.
Yeah. I mean, based on what we do know, do you think all of this will have the result of reducing the backlog? Presumably that's the main driver here, in the same way that for Gawk, the main driver was producing a more stable prison population. Will it work?
Again, the devil's in the detail, which we don't have, and we don't have any data or modelling. So The lawyers are saying that they don't think juries make the fundamental difference to delays in the courts at the moment, that there are other major things. So one issue which the lawyers talk about a lot and is a very real issue is that people who are awaiting their trial in prison, so on remand, are being brought to court late or not at all. So they need to be brought to court in secure vans. But what's happening is you've got a whole court full of people and they're just waiting, literally, for this van to turn up for hours and hours and hours. Now, clearly that affects delays in the backlog. But the irony is, as well, is they talk about the Crown Court backlog. There's actually a significant backlog in the magistrates' courts. So the government are proposing to put more work into the magistrates' court to alleviate the backlogs in the Crown Court, despite the fact that there are significant backlogs in the magistrates' court. So, I mean, we've talked quite a lot in the negative, dare I say it, Rob. What have you been most pleased that the government has done in 2025?
Well, you're right. Perhaps I've been a bit curmudgeonly about the sentence.
You curmudgeonly?
No, well...
Rob!
I mean, I think this issue of suspending the short sentences, it's been around a long time. And it's one that campaigners, prison reform campaigners, have tried to get some movement on for many, many years. Even the last government, Alex Chalk, we had him on our podcast earlier this year, when he was Justice Secretary, he went quite a long way towards suspending or getting rid of, in some way, most short prison sentences. And finally, it looks like it is going to come to pass. And I think that's quite an important step. Whether or not it has the impact in terms of numbers that are projected, I think to actually say, look, there is not much point for the vast majority of people who get short sentences putting them in prison for a few days or weeks. Or
I mean, everybody agrees on that, don't they?
I think
it's pretty useless to spend 2 months in prison.
Exactly. So I think the prison reform sector can take a bit of credit for campaigning on that over many years, and it's good to see that seems finally, it hasn't actually got royal assent yet, but it seems to be en route for that in the early part of next year, and I think that's something I'm pleased with. What about you?
Well, actually, pretty unexpected. Sir Brian Levison, in his very long part 1 of his review of efficiency in the courts, brought up this issue about criminal records reform, which is something that Transform Justice has been campaigning about in partnership with the charity Unlocked for many years. So Sir Brian said, I think the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act should be reviewed. And so what we're talking about here are criminal records checks. These are the kind of checks that employers ask for when people are going for jobs to tell them whether the person has a criminal record. And some previous offences come up and some have a sort of shelf life and don't come up after a certain number of years. And we've been campaigning for reform of this because we think too much which is minor comes up for too long. So Brian asked for an overall review of that. And lo and behold, in the speech Lammy gave about restricting jury trials, he added in that he was looking to simplify and make more proportionate our criminal records disclosure system. So let's see what happens next year about that, because, again, the devil is in the detail.
Yeah, no.
But it was good.
Yeah, and that's positive. And I know some people will remember that David Lammy did a major piece of work some years ago about racial disparities in the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And, he recommended, more use of diversion from prosecution, trying to enable people not to get caught up so much in their past and the criminal justice system and so on. So perhaps that's a little sign that we can expect something positive from him next year.
Yes, absolutely.
But, of course, there's the politics. I mean, the Conservatives have a particularly hard line.
Robert Jenrick, yeah.
Justice spokesman, the Reform UK party sound, if anything.
They want to build many, many more prison places.
Yeah, I mean, how well do you think a more progressive agenda on crime, if indeed there is one, how will that manage to navigate those pressures?
It's very hard to see that progressive criminal justice is going to make much headway in the short term. But actually, there's some unexpected pieces. Genrick is opposing some aspects of these restriction of jury trials. And actually, so far, neither the Conservatives nor the Reform have opposed the idea of reforming criminal records disclosure. So let's see on that front.
OK. Well, I think we probably need to call things to a halt for 2025. Let's end it in the normal way. If you were Prime Minister, Penelope, may happen one day, what one thing would you do to improve the justice system?
I mean, that's a huge question. I will go back to the Leveson Review and say perhaps a huge game changer to the system would be to divert more cases from being prosecuted in the first place and not have them in the courts. The police have powers to deal with them outside the courts, to give people out-of-court resolutions, cautions, and so on. And that resolves the case both for victims as well as the person who's committed the crime without it getting into our sclerotic court system. And actually, the outcomes are probably better because you can get things done quicker and you can refer people like who have drug problems to services and so on. So that would improve things a lot. I mean, obviously, the police already do it. We want them to do it more. Mm-hmm. Rob, what about you?
Well, hidden away in David Gauke's sentencing review was this idea that in the longer term, there should be a body made up of experts, dare I say, who should advise the government about the direction of travel on criminal justice. Do we want to put more and more people in prison forever and ever? Or should we be saying, hang on, it's not very effective, it's very expensive, there have got to be a different way? Now, the government haven't said they're going to set up any such body. In fact, the body that could sort of do a little bit of that, the Sentencing Council, is being kind of neutered, or its powers are being restricted. So I think that's a mistake, and I think there's an opportunity to try and take the politics out of prisons and punishment. And so I would hope that the Prime Minister will create this body to try and do that.
I think it's a great idea. You're talking about a kind of equivalent of NICE for criminal justice. So NICE says what medicines the government can approve to be used by doctors and so on the basis of hard evidence.
Yeah, that's the...
And they are independent.
Yeah, so that's the National Institute for Clinical Excellence.
Yeah.
So we need a National Institute for Criminal Justice Excellence.
Yes, great idea. Thanks, Rob. And you'll find links to reports and policies we've discussed in our programme notes. And if you have ideas for future podcasts, do get in touch. Bye.
Bye-bye.